morning, everybody, and welcome to the British Chamber of Business's webinar on cybersecurity. Really excited to introduce our panel to you this morning on what is perhaps a much misunderstood topic, which we're going to be discovering. We've got some great expertise from around the world. I'd firstly like to, I'll introduce the panelists and I'll invite them to speak separately, and perhaps explore some of the content in greater detail. But first, I'd like to thank Victoria White from the Commonwealth and Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office in South Africa and the Prosperity Fund specifically for sponsoring this event and ensuring we take this subject seriously. And she'll talk about what the British government is doing in this area. I'd like to invite James from BT Communications, who's Director of Security and Sales across Asia, the Middle East and Africa. Welcome James Hanna from Singapore this morning. Sean de Kooker, National Special Projects Manager for G4S South Africa, who's in Santon, but normally working up the road in Centurion. We have Nadia Musaji, entrepreneur, engineer, and co-founder of the Women's Hub, who describes herself as a serial entrepreneur. That's going to be giving us different insights into some of the factors that female entrepreneurs need to consider from a cybersecurity perspective. And then from our Lex Africa network, Alex Namuli Blazovic, who is a cyber security expert from a legal perspective. So really looking forward to getting your insights later, Alice. And of course, my colleague and Vice President Cecilia Albertyn, she'll be introducing your questions to the panelists as we go out throughout the session and the webinar. I do remind you that this is being recorded. I do encourage you to be interactive. Please post your questions using the chat function, and we'll endeavor to feed those into the panelists as we go through the webinar. So before we start, we do encourage interactivity and engagement. We'd like to run our first icebreaker poll, which is going to appear on your screen now. I've got Ema and Mission Control. If you could cue that up for us, please, Ema. So taking a Star Wars theme, given the cybersecurity space, cybersecurity in 2021, which Star Wars movie is it? The Force Awakens, Attack of the Clones, The Rise of Skywalker, or The Phantom Menace? So just please respond to that quickly. We can see what type of movie. In fact, we can bring that down even, perhaps explore those results after Victoria's spoken to us. I'll remind you again to Victoria, Vicky, thank you so much for sponsoring this event. It'd be great to hear from what you're doing from the prosperity perspective at the FCDO in this space.
Great, thank you so much, Leon, and I'm really grateful to you and the Chamber for organising this webinar on such an important issue, and I'm really hoping that I'll be able to glean some valuable insight from this brilliant group of panellists and the Q&A session today. So a big thank you to all the speakers and attendees for giving up their time today. So a little about me and my role at the British High Commission. As Leon said, I work for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, but I'm posted here in Pretoria. And I arrived at the end of 2020 to lead the UK's objectives on cyber-related issues in Southern Africa. My role is a brand new position in the High Commission and one of just 20 cyber leads globally. So I hope that in itself demonstrates the high degree of importance that the UK government attaches to engaging with the South African government in particular, as well as more broadly in the region on cyber. The UK's National Cyber Strategy set out our plan to make Britain a confident, capable, resilient and in a fast-moving digital world. As the internet and digital technology become ever more fundamental to the UK's prosperity, security and way of life, we must approach cyber as an opportunity as well as a risk. As governments around the world continue to focus on economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, cyber can really help the transition to digital ways of working, boost skills and productivity across the world and unlock the benefits of new technologies. Our cyber defences underpin national resilience, preventing harm to citizens and tackling wider security risks from criminals and states. Our economic prosperity and social well-being increasingly depends on the openness and security of networks that extend beyond our own borders. So it's absolutely essential that we work closely with international partners like South Africa to ensure the continuation of a free, open, peaceful and secure cyberspace that delivers these benefits. That's why I'm really pleased to share with you that the UK and South Africa will hold the first ever government-to-government bilateral dialogue focused solely on cyber-related issues in April this year. The UK will also continue its commitment to the Digital Access Programme in South Africa for 2021. And the primary purpose of this programme is to catalyse more inclusive, affordable, safe and secure digital access for those that are digitally excluded. We have a very specific pillar of activity under this programme on cybersecurity that seeks to build resilience to cybersecurity risks, threats, and harms that affect government, business, and citizens, particularly those who are most vulnerable in society. And we really hope the Digital Access Programme will help the South African government's ambition to bridge the digital divide. Digital technologies give the world and its citizens opportunities like never before. This connection has helped more people escape poverty around the world at a pace that's never been seen. Yet this new opportunity does bring threats, and prosperity now depends on our collective ability to secure our technology, data, and networks from the many threats that we face. So as we start this new area of collaboration between the UK and South Africa, we'll explore areas where we can collaborate, where we have common ground, and where we can seek to achieve mutual benefits. And our governments both recognise there will be challenges ahead that we need to discuss and work through together. And really, that's my objective for joining this webinar today, to fully understand the biggest challenges and threats you will face, how you've adapted to these challenges, particularly in light of COVID-19, and what more the High Commission could be doing to help support you here in South Africa. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all, and please do reach out to me after the event if there's more that you would like to discuss. And I will stop there and I'll hand you back to Leon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vicky, for that introduction and really giving an overview to the extent of which we are in bilateral dialogues with the South African government. So we're really keen to kind of hear from you, and we're going to come to our panelists shortly, but hear from you, the audience and members, your observations, experiences, and questions as well. I think as we talk about the bilateral dialogue, something that really springs to mind is the kind of international connectivity and interrelatedness that cyber brings as an opportunity, but equally parallel to that, it brings huge threats. So we can see how Cambridge Analytica can affect the outcome of elections in the States. People in the Ukraine can affect the outcome of the presidential elections. This sprung to light with Brexit, where we could access disenfranchised voters and really shift a national dialogue and indeed national policy. And that's before we even start looking at some of the cybercrime aspects. And some of the things we're going to be exploring is, do we have the right systems in place in terms of our organizations? Do we have the right physical infrastructure setups? Do we have the right training? Do we have the right organizational culture to adapt to this? So I'm going to really introduce the first topic now to kind of trigger some dialogue, and really looking at cybersecurity threats and opportunities will increase with the expansion and networks, with the expansion of networks and connectivity across Africa and the globe. African governments face a fast evolving array of digital threats, from cyber attacks, espionage, critical infrastructure sabotage, organized crime, and the need to combat innovation. We'd like to hear from the panelists to see, what are you experiencing? What are you seeing in terms of these key areas? And perhaps we could come to you in Singapore first, James, to see what BT are doing and what are you seeing in your experience. And you're covering a very big region there, so you must have some really good insights.
Yeah, thanks, Leon, and thanks for the invite to today's session. Yeah, if you look, there's just continuing to be an explosion of cyber threats that are continuing to happen. And there's two things that are really driving that at the moment. We've seen one is as we were talking about before, the increased digital transformation, which is having a massive impact and increasing the surface area in which criminals can exploit. We've seen the pandemic and the different ways in which people are working give new opportunities as well. And we're seeing that serious organised crime continue to expand and move into this void. So, I mean, if I think probably over the last 12 months, we've seen more than a 300% increase in cyber attacks impacting our customers and enterprises as a whole. And I think there's a couple of things that are really driving that. There's phishing, and you may have heard that term before, which is when people pretend to be somebody else, send emails, try and tempt you to click on something or to open an email or open a web link. And really that's the start of an attack. Because what they're looking to try and do is to build and to open up a way of stealing your data. Now, they're either looking to do a number of things. They're looking to steal data. They're looking to deploy something that they can then use to extort money from you. They're looking to deny service that your company might need, and therefore be a hacktivist in terms of trying to trying to bring publicity to a political activity. And I think what we're seeing more and more of is the rise, as I said, of crime, and it being linked to extortion. So a lot of this is about how organisations are looking to generate income on the back of these cyber attacks. So one of the things we always talk to customers about is understand the value of your business, and therefore where you're more likely to be attacked. Is it that someone's going to try and ransomware you? Is it that they're going to try and do that either through ransomware or through denial of service, and link the two of those together? And we've seen a lot more of that across the region. Are they going to look at stealing your customers' information and then either sell that in the dark web, or again use that to blackmail you, to say, if you don't pay us large sums of money, then we're going to release your customers' data into the public space, and therefore create damage to your brand, because we know that consumers attach a great value to cybersecurity? Or are they going to try and intercept some of your financial transactions? So there's a number of different ways, depending on what your business is, in which the cyber criminals can then target you. So if you understand where your value is, then you can work out what you need to do to protect it. But what we're seeing is that because we've moved more and more into this pandemic and working from home, I mean, ourselves, we had to move over 30,000 of our employees to home working over a week. And that included, you know, some of our customer service agents, people who would be dealing with financial transactions, all sorts of types of employees. And that creates, as I was saying earlier, a much bigger threat surface for people to target. And so one of the most important things is that what we call the human firewall. So teaching your employees what they need to do, how they need to cope, how to keep an eye out for things that could eventually do them harm. And it was linked in with that is having a good, clean, clear, crisp understanding of what they need to do if they do see something, and make it transparent. So there's a clear escalation path and something that they can raise so that the organisation can understand what they need to do on the back of it. So there's a couple of things that we're seeing at the moment, and more than happy to delve into any of those in more detail, or to answer any questions on the chat as we go through.
Thanks, James. I'm perhaps going to come back to that human firewall, and it'd be interesting to look at some of the cultural differences, given that the region you cover, whether there's anything specific to those regions and behaviors and performance cultures that you've seen. But before perhaps coming back to that, great point to bring Sean de Coker in from G4S. You actually, I believe you run the control center for G4S, so you have visibility of a lot of the incidents that take place. What have been your experience and insights, Sean?
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Leon, and thanks for the opportunity. So from a G4S perspective, most people will know we're a physical security company, and more recently we've moved away from just being seen as a man guarding business or a cash in transit business, and more towards an integrated solutions expert. And that comes with its challenges. We need to manage risk like any security company. But because we're a bit more technology enabled, that's brought in a whole host of other challenges from a cybersecurity perspective. We've got a system called Risk 360, which aggregates all of our technologies that we use on sites, from CCTV to guard monitoring to monitoring our vehicles. And because it's technology enabled, it's brought in a lot of security related risks for us. Everything that we do is based on cloud servers. We are hosted on the GCP, Google Cloud servers. And so there's a lot of security that comes with that. We're also a Google business. We use Gmail and all the Google services. So there's a lot of security that comes with that. But we've seen that we've got customers like Amazon that come into South Africa that need security at their data centers, for example. There's a reliance on physical security as well as technology security. And that physical security is that barrier to entry, making sure no one gets to your stuff, and making sure that that works in concert with your cybersecurity model. Our IT group IT team look after that, but we as a physical security business have a lot of approaches from our customers to make sure that we protect as much as we can. So it used to be just making sure that the wrong person doesn't come into their office, but now it's making sure that their data is protected, and the data that we collect on their behalf for the services we provide and for operations that we control for them is protected as well.
So that's really interesting, because it makes me think of a point that James mentioned in terms of the interrelatedness of physical security and cybersecurity. So if you need to protect your physical infrastructure is what I'm hearing, because that will be the first point of your data and cyber being compromised. But then you're working with partners, be it AWS, be it Google, be it Microsoft. Perhaps I'll answer this and kind of go back to James quickly, referring to that question around the human firewall. But from your perspective, what control do you have when you're relying on partners such as Google, such as AWS, to kind of ensure your cyber integrity?
So with that, they've got their own policies, and we piggyback on those policies. We have, I think, James, that human factor is very important. We've got a business with an enormous amount of people. We've got, with the technology enablement that I mentioned, we've got not just our management level, we've got our guarding level that interacts with technology. So there's another entry point now. So now it's not just, let's say, a few thousand people. Now it's across the globe, it's 530,000 people that could be the accessible point to a threat. And it's making sure that the people are cognizant of the threat, understand it, and know what to do when they encounter it. Because most people don't know what cybersecurity looks like. It could be, most people have seen an SMS or an email, but it could be something different. It manifests itself in different ways. And it's more of a training and a knowledge type of thing. So sharing the knowledge of what you need to know and what you need to do when this happens.
Perhaps before I come to you, James, on that specific question, I might invite Nadia to contribute, because I think, BTG4S, large corporate organizations working with Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Google, how would that impact a smaller owner-managed business, Nadia? What has been your experiences there?
So it's interesting in small businesses, and cybersecurity is probably the last thing on the list of things that you're worried about. If you think about SMMEs, and especially now when we've lost about 40% of our SMMEs, so that's 60% that's remaining due to post-COVID. All they're worried about is getting turnover, and they're in survivalist mode, right? They're just trying to make ends meet. And what it shows, and all the data showing, is that they're exceptionally vulnerable to cyber attacks because they don't have any of the protections that you'd necessarily either pay for or even just go on training for, etc. And so, just interestingly, we're launching a cybersecurity training program for female founders, because women experience cybersecurity and cyber threats in a completely different way. And we asked everybody who applied a simple question. We said, how many of you have a cybersecurity policy in your business? And something like 8% of all our participants had a cybersecurity policy, right? When you ask them to rate their knowledge or understanding of cybersecurity at like 1 to 5, most of the people are at 1s, right? So very rudimentary levels, understanding of cybersecurity. And so what this means is that they're increasingly vulnerable. And we're starting to see a lot more of cybersecurity attacks at small businesses because they are so vulnerable, right? And, it's the data coming back is shocking, because we'll lose a lot more. And so, I've made this statement that said, COVID was the first wave, right? The second wave is a cyber pandemic that's going to kill a whole lot of our SMMEs if we don't act now.
I think no, that's a really interesting insight, and 90% of our economy here in South Africa is made up of SMMEs, so it's critical. And I think we'll come back and explore some of the themes you've raised there. James, hearing what Nadia said and Sean, and perhaps going back to my question around, I'm really interested: are there different challenges across different regions, or essentially is cyber completely interrelated and cascades across all global regions? What have you seen?
I think the one thing is cyber is everywhere. Okay, is in the cyber criminals are getting together, collaborating across boundaries. There is no geographic boundaries from that perspective. Yeah. We've seen that from where they're targeting, but also quite often a number of customers or companies get caught in the crossfire. So the cyber criminals might be targeting one organization, but because it's pretty indiscriminate, or can be, then you can see that impacting and hitting a number of other customers. I mean, you think back to the NotPetya virus and malware that was happening a couple of years ago, and how many organizations that ended up impacting. I think there's a couple of things. There's one is, what can you do to protect yourself? And then there's how do you manage your supply chain? So, you can look at your own organization, you can look at your own employees and those people who are connecting directly to your own infrastructure. But actually, if you think about it, there's lots of other people in that supply chain who have also got access to, again, depending on the size of your organization, to your business. So whether that's people who are logging on and have access to certain parts of your business, or all the way through where you have contractors and you have other services as well. And we've seen that start to change some people's thinking. You would have probably seen in the press all the things around solar winds that came out recently. And so, it's changing people's views to say, actually, there could be something lingering around in my network. It's been there for a while, I don't know. So we're starting to see the approach of what we call assumed breach, or how to manage a dirty network. So, you can't be assured that your network is always clean. So therefore, how do you manage it, and how do you operate in that space? I think coming back to your point though, do we see differences within each of the individual countries? There are some. And we do see that. So, if I take that working from home piece that I spoke about previously in terms of the pandemic, cyber criminals are latching onto that. So where before you would have been in an office environment and you could have gone and asked somebody, now you might be working from home, and if you've got an email or a voice call from a customer and they're saying, oh, can you give me this piece of information or this piece of data, then you might find, or your employees might find, they're pressurized into giving something that they wouldn't have given, or they would have gone and asked somebody if they were in that office environment. So we are seeing that being exploited as well. So it does come back to, you giving people the right tips and tools to be able to identify some of this. And what we also do when we talk to our customers is we talk about understand the different personas of your employees, and therefore the different risks they're likely to encounter. So if you've got somebody in your accounts payables department, then think about they might be targeted with, this is an email that looks like it comes from the CFO saying we need to raise an urgent payment to this company who's not on your preferred payers list. Now those people again would be more vulnerable because they're now isolated. So understand that, understand the difference of some of your staff who now may be working from Starbucks or a local coffee shop, and that having a different IT infrastructure as well. So there's a number of different ways in which this is changing, and different geographies have got different cultural potential vulnerabilities.
No, it's a really good point. It's something I've noticed. At the beginning of lockdown, I was working across 9 different time zones on a strategy project, and going from the Far East, coming through the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and going to North America, there were different challenges. I think we're all faced with the challenges of having to manage homeschooling our dogs and pets and have a home office. So we all got used to seeing each other's kids and pets interrupt our sessions, which has become the norm. But also looking at, particularly from an African perspective, and where we are on the Human Development Index and GDP, actually how many of our employees have sufficient workspace, sufficient connectivity to pivot to working from home very quickly. And I know that's something that's been very topical from an African perspective. Moving on, and thanks so much. And I do encourage the audience, please feel free to raise your hand and raise some questions to the Q&A function. Perhaps I can see the results of the first poll email, just for a bit of fun in terms of where we see cyber from a Star Wars perspective. Perhaps you could share those. So The Force Awakens, which hopefully we're helping do today. The Attack of the Clones comes in. I think The Phantom Menace suggests something of an unknown threat. That's where we are. I'd like to now move on to perhaps more of a legal perspective and explore our next poll. And thanks for raising your hand, Raja. We'll come to you after this. Perhaps we can, before I raise my, before I raise my next topic, look at a poll. If you could raise that for me, please, Ema. Just to kind of get some understanding of where the audience is from what you've experienced in your business and what is your biggest concern. So you can see the question there: which of the following types of cybercrime are of most concern to your business? Malware, ransomware, critical infrastructure sabotage or denial of service attacks, phishing, which we've heard this morning, plus business email compromising, data theft, espionage, or other. And if other, please do specify. And perhaps while you're answering that question, we'll come back to those results afterwards. I'm really looking at you, Alice. What is the status of cyber law in South Africa? And Alice, it's really important to mention you're up in Uganda today. You're part of the Lex network that covers 27 countries in Africa, the Lex Legal Network, which are a very active chamber member. So it'd be interesting to hear what is the status of cyber law, perhaps in South Africa, but equally from a broader African perspective. And which countries have still not ratified the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, known as the Malabo Convention, which could give a framework for responding to these threats. I'd be really keen to get your legal insights and experiences, Alice.
Thank you very much, Leon. Definitely very pleased to be here and share my experience. I think it's important to, first of all, understand where we are at on the continent as a whole, and pretty much what is pushing all these like cyber threats. You're all aware that Africa is experiencing some exponential growth in e-commerce or the use of the internet. So which means that there's just so much use of data, and meaning all these like tech companies, high-tech startups on the scene on the continent, which have definitely changed the way we live and we do business, use a lot of data to transact business. From the fintechs we have, which transact a lot of money across the continent. But then what does that all mean? It means that so many people definitely now being able to access internet or use the internet, and of course, hence the increase in crime. But then what initiatives are there on the continent that have the African Union, all different countries or different blocks, regional blocks are doing? In 2014, the African Union came up with a cybersecurity convention, or which we call the Malabo Convention. Unfortunately, to date, only 10 countries out of the 53 countries have signed the treaty. And out of the 10, only 2 have ratified the treaty in their countries. And out of, again, the 53 countries, only 24 countries have data protection laws. So I think you can see how we are doing badly. But it's not all, I guess, so bad. What I sense on the continent, because of the different platforms that I usually engage in all over the continent, the issue is not really more about lack of laws. It's mainly lack of implementation or lack of enforcement, because you find like so many countries have some kind of regulations to govern the internet. Like, for example, in Uganda, before we had a Data Protection Act, we had so many regulations that were governing the misuse of the internet. But then you find that some countries would have certain regulations or laws, but they will still keep asking for more and more laws. And even when these laws are passed, they're never enforced. So that's basically our main challenge. I know for South Africa is one of the 24 countries that has a data protection regulation and has cyber regulations. So, but then the question is that to what percentage? That's the most important issue is that, yes, you could have the laws, but what percentage are you, have those laws been implemented? And unfortunately, not a very big percentage.
Yeah. Thanks, Alice. It's really interesting. We've been talking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement increasingly this year as it came into pass, I believe, on New Year's Eve. And we're still waiting to be ratified by 1 or 2 countries. So we've made some progress there. Here with the Malabo, we're looking at only 2 countries having ratified it. But the greater challenge really is around enforcement, appetite to enforce, but also the ability to enforce, because these are quite complex crimes to actually, not to perpetrate, but indeed to prosecute. Do we have the skill sets within the police force, within the legal sector, within the prosecution departments to effect successful prosecutions? Yeah,
so apart from definitely the implementation, the other big challenge we have is a lack of, I guess, lack of awareness. So many people, so many citizens on the continent have no clue what kind of threats or vulnerability definitely they expose themselves to. Someone mentioned about remote working. Right now, what we see on the continent is that so many people are using unsecure networks to access their information from their office servers, but all this they're doing it outside without very, very secure networks. But if I would ask you a question, are the employees aware, or are the staff aware, or are these companies aware? Nadia said it very well. They are more interested in, the profits as opposed to these other threats that definitely have made these companies very, very vulnerable. In addition to lack of awareness, there's of course lack of skill. There are very, very few professionals on the continent who even have an idea what, I guess, cybercrime is or what cybersecurity is, and also lack of training of our judges, the judicial system, and this cuts across all African continent, the African continent. So you will have the police. Very few countries have a well-equipped police to be able to investigate this kind of crime. But then, if the police do their job, do our judges are they aware? Do they even know what's definitely the kind of cases that are before them? And the other issue, actually, I think the most important challenge is that some of these laws, that's why actually the African Union Convention is extremely important, that there's no collaboration among African countries. So I think it was James or someone who mentioned that, because when you talk about cyber jurisdiction to it.
We're just losing you there, Alice, which I'll jump in because I think you raised some really interesting points. I'm hearing creating awareness is absolutely. So we'll just meet Alex for a second until we get her line back. And because you're raising a really important issue around lack of awareness, but also a lack of skill. Researcher Cecilia.
Hello.
Yeah. Well, hi, Alice. Yes.
We can hear you now, Alice. Sorry, we lost you a bit. We can hear you now.
Yeah, Alice, I was just summarizing what you said there. And yeah, and I think you raise a really good point around awareness, but also the lack of skills. So from awareness from a consumer perspective, but also a skills perspective from law enforcement, from the legal sector, from a national security perspective within our defense professionals as well. Regimes have tumbled in Libya, in other countries because of cyber attacks and cyber threats, to the point where the British Army now has a general in charge of a cyber unit division. And we're having to recruit a different type of military personnel to come in as older or younger, perhaps less physically robust, but much more skilled in engaging with these cyber threats. It's not just about boots on the grounds and people patrolling with weaponry. Thanks for that. And I think some of the research Cecilia did ahead of this webinar was there's actually a skills gap to the extent of 100,000 shortage for cyber professionals to come into to come into this space, which again presents itself as an opportunity. Perhaps before we look at the results of the last poll, Cecilia, we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, I think, and I'd like to comment on something that Alice said, but I'll do that at a later stage. Around also, I don't think there's proper due process for cyber crimes and reporting it, and people just don't actually know where to go. And if there is a channel, they're not aware of it. So it starts with that as well. But before we can talk about that again a bit later, Raj and Govinder, raise your hand. Raj, I'm going to put you on speaker. So if you'd like to ask your question,
Yeah, thank you very much. Interesting subject. I'm almost afraid to ask the question because it sounds so simplistic, but I think it's an important point anyway. You know, many organizations, and I'm talking about us in particular, have gone through the process of giving access to every single employee. And I'm talking about email access and so forth through the systems and stuff to every single employee, including shop floor employees as well. But I don't think we've actually done a great job of educating and doing a change management process around cybersecurity. We spoke and we've done a lot of work around utilization. What do you use it for? We spoke about bring your own device and how we've allowed that kind of thing to go into the system. We've done a lot of work around that. But I don't think we've actually done a lot of work around cybersecurity and, you know, giving some teachings and learnings and providing some support around that. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. And then the second thing I want to say is that cybersecurity, you know, has a more universal message, and that is it's not only attack on companies because, again, because you give people access through to your networks and so forth with their own devices. You're also creating a bit of threat, you know, when people do things in their personal capacity. And what's that is. I just wanted to check, is that a pervasive issue and a problem throughout, or is it just something that I'm thinking up in my head based on the icebreaker that just came through?
Yes, thanks, Raj. In fact, James, I can see you nodding your head there. Did you want to jump in? Oh, sorry, James, you seem to have lost your sound, James.
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that there's two things there. So one, absolutely on the training piece, that is so important. You can do that relatively simply, and there's no point spending lots of money on technology. Obviously, you need to do that as well, but unless you really educate your employees, and simple phishing type educational pieces are really effective. So teaching people how to identify something that's come from someone else. You know, the old adage of if it's too good to be true, it probably is. You know, so just be careful on those things. And it does have a halo impact, because not only are you protecting your organization, but actually we find these things, and even doing things in schools and educational environments, helps to improve the awareness of the general population, because it's, you know, there's something that we all are employees, but actually we're all people as well, and we've got our own personal life, and so it's about how you make sure you. And then I think the other piece that you raised is around bring your own device, and what we call that the end point, and the end point is becoming more and more of a risk. So one of the things to invest in is proper endpoint protection. So, you know, that will manage your email and your device. So if there is anything harmful on your device, protect your business. But I think, you know, and Nadia was talking about it earlier, what about for SMEs though, who don't really have a lot of these skills and capabilities within their own organization? I think the one tip there is get the basics right. You'll often see patches come out from Microsoft telling you to update, or Apple telling you to update to the latest version and download and click on patches. Patch management is so important, because most of the time when we see threats and we see cyber criminals exploiting them, it's known patches, it's known issues. And quite often there's already patches out there. And if you've deployed it, then actually you're protected. So, you know, one thing is to make sure you've got a good regime of patch management across your technology estate. Hopefully that.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think it's really. Sorry, go ahead, Alice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add on to what James has said, that I think it's also important for companies to know that with the kind of exposures definitely their employees or staff expose them to, the vulnerabilities they expose them to, it's important they come up with internal data protection policies. Now, like, for example, of course, every country has a jurisdiction, has a requirement on what a data collector, because when you collect data you become a data collector. When you collect data from data subjects, you're required to let them know about in case of a data breach. So it's important to let your staff or employees know about, as soon as they detect a breach, you're required to report it to the regulatory authority as soon as possible, and then of course come up with some kind of remedy. And you're also supposed to notify the data subjects. One of the things that is very key to most of the African countries right now is that because of lack of enforcement of our local laws, you find that the GDPR always comes into play, because you'll find in one or another, many countries or many jurisdictions with these big global tech companies that are operating in Africa, you'll find that in one or another that GDPR affects us. And they have very, very strict provisions when it comes to breach. And I think either lack of consent from data subjects. So you have to be very, very conscious and aware that first of all, you've obtained the consent. As a company or a business, you have to keep checking your data to ensure that all the consents are updated, and to make sure that definitely there's no data breach.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. And thanks to Raj from the Weir Group there for a good question. I think often the most simple question is the one we all want to ask and answer. And I think we change management so often when we introduce new ways of working, new legislations, we expect it to cascade through our organizations via osmosis. You need a structured change management process for large organizations. And then SMEs argue it's more easier to cascade that change. It's just affording the access to the expertise. Really good interactivity. We're going to move on now. Perhaps we can look at the results of that poll, Ema, in terms of people's chief concerns from a cyber perspective. So malware, not such a huge perceived threat, nor ransomware, nor critical infrastructure. Phishing, over half of us are worried about our email compromise and our phishing, and data theft and espionage. That's interesting. Thank you. So moving on to the next topic, and really going to be looking at you, Nadia, to kind of lead our response on this. What are the key areas where businesses in Africa seem to lack when it comes to digital innovation and adaptation? And what are the key things that need to be addressed? And how can government or business get this right? And how can we support each other better through ecosystems such as the Chamber, through these networks?
Thanks so much. And one of the most interesting things about our continent and kind of this kind of digital revolution, digital disruption, whatever buzzwords you want to call it, is that we've got probably the fastest growing tech ecosystem anywhere in the world. We've got the youngest population, so they are completely innate with mobile technology. And you start to see this with the growing number of kind of mobile phones and access to smartphones. Right, and so you've also starting to see amazing innovations that are leapfrogging a lot of our developmental challenges. So that's the shining light, and that's the optimism in me going, this continent is ripe for innovation, for driving the fourth industrial revolution agenda more than any other continent. Right, the challenges become things like the lack of skills. Right, and so we work around ensuring enough technical skills are there on the continent, right? We don't have enough engineers. We don't have, and this is not just software engineers, but hardware engineers as well. We can have the fanciest mobile phones, but if we don't have access to stable electricity and connectivity, then we actually just have a really expensive paperweight. And so, you know, these are some of the key challenges. So now, you know, on the one hand, we're driving kind of this digital economy, and on the other hand, we've still got some very much key developmental challenges. And then on the third piece is we've got an aging government in most of our countries who truly does not understand technology, right? And so they're trying to kind of create policies, regulate in an area that is a bit of a vacuum for them. And this is not just an African problem. If you've watched the US Senate inquiries with, you know, Google and Facebook, etc., and them asking some of the most interesting questions to these tech companies about how their technology works, and you can see that fundamentally they have no clue, right? And so you're asking somebody who's kind of 86 years old to regulate technology that, you know, they're barely able to send an SMS, right? And now you're asking them to regulate fintech. So you're starting to see those challenges, and then you're starting to see governments threatened by technology and what young people and innovators can actually do with technology around, you know, accountability for government, accountability on finances, and then they shut it down, right? And so you've seen, you know, shutdown of internet across a number of African countries. And so in this spectrum, we start to see some of the challenges emerge. You know, we've almost got a struggle here on the continent, you know, two parts. We've got this, you know, innovation that is driving, you know, a lot of really cool things on the continent. And then you've got, you know, some archaic systems, and we've got the lack of infrastructure and skills. And then on top of all of that is cybersecurity, right? Because what happens now is that as we move into this digital space, you know, as James, you know, rightly started off with, there are no borders in the virtual space, right? And so we're now playing with everybody else. And, you know, as my fellow panelists have said, we're just not ready from a security perspective to be able to make sure that our infrastructure is safe. We're also not able to draw the right kind of skills. You know, so we're already on a skills deficit in terms of, you know, cybersecurity skills. You know, the top tech companies are poaching all, you know, the cybersecurity experts. And so what is left, it's slim pickings, if any, you know, for our governments to be able to kind of recruit good talent in. So, you know, we have to kind of really think very strategically around how is it that we're able to create the skills that is needed to create a safe virtual space for us all to thrive. And then how is it that we're able to create the policies and regulations that are enabling entrepreneurs to be able to thrive in this space, and then making sure that we have the kind of infrastructure required to actually reach that full potential that we have for this continent.
Nadia, you raised some really interesting subjects. I was actually speaking about these last night with Emma Wade-Smith, Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner. And these are my views. What I see South Africa doing, and we discussed this with Maletsi and Becky at recent chamber events, is the skills shortage is an opportunity, but it's also a threat. You know, we have the world's youngest population. We have the world's fastest growing population. By 2035, we'll have 3 billion people seeking employment under the age of 30. Yet our skills agenda seems to be based on the kind of 1980s industrial complex, as opposed to the security cyber industrial complex of the 2020s. So kind of engaging with work, with employers to see what are the skills required for the future? How do we train those quickly so we can get these people working and actually address that 100,000 cyber skills security professionals that we need? We're running out of time, which is great because we've got so much content. Cecilia, perhaps I can come to you. I believe there's a question or two from the audience.
Yeah, I'm going to actually lock together John Murphy as well as Mohsin Hassim have kind of been speaking to the same thing. I like Mo's way of putting it. The real war is not on the ground, but in the cloud, and that it's a threat that very few are really perceiving and getting the reality of it. John Murphy asks, how do you get organizations and executives to really understand the importance of the organization having appropriate cyber risk awareness training for its employees? Is an important question. And if the top management don't get it or buy into it, how do you even start to think about cascading it down? And Nadia, you can speak from an SME perspective as well, but also maybe James and Sean can speak from working for bigger organizations. What do you see at executive level? How does that seep into the culture of the whole organization?
You know, what's been interesting, and we're running a number of training programs for SMMEs, and the biggest reason and the biggest driver is a financial one. And that's because they're understanding the risks now associated as these policies, as GDPR and POPI comes in. There's actually financial penalties if you have a data breach, right? It can be devastating from a reputational perspective of a company when you have these breaches. There's a loss of trust. Nobody wants to work with you anymore because they, and there's now stigma attached to companies where there have been breaches, right? And so companies are actually moving a little bit away and going, what, if we invest now in the long, a little bit now, will save us in the long term huge, reputational risk plus, financial challenges. And so it's around creating awareness on, cybersecurity. And that it doesn't have to be, this expensive thing. It's not this difficult thing. I mean, we did something as basic as password protection and asking employers how often do they change their password. It's astounding how many people share their passwords in terms of, we did this big survey, and 60% of our SMME founders were sharing their passwords to their emails, to all sorts of accounts, right? And so, it's really about going, do you have, second authentication with your passwords, what are the basic things? And these are not, very expensive things. These are not very difficult things, but they, small, simple things that you can implement in your businesses to make sure that you actually are, protected in the long term. So it's really about, creating awareness, and organizations like the chambers and institutions like ours are the forefront. And I think it's a responsibility for ours to create a general public awareness around cybersecurity, not even just for businesses, but also for individuals as well.
Sorry, Cecilia, your mic just didn't pick that up then. It's, you're not on mute, it's just...
Oh, sorry, I'm asking, I'd love to hear from James and Sean from a bigger company perspective, what you've been seeing.
Do you want me to, if I go first? So absolutely, and I think, following on from Nadia's points there, there's so much more, and we're seeing it. The number 2 thing on board agendas at the moment is cybersecurity. The only thing that's above it is the pandemic. So it is high on most large corporations' agenda at the board and at the risk committee. For the reasons that Nadia mentioned, you've got GDPR there, which has got substantial fines associated with it. In lots of jurisdictions, there's regulations that demand that companies notify of data breaches within certain timeframes. Directors in some jurisdictions are personally liable and responsible for data breaches. So as well as just the impact on your brand, in terms of consumers will move away from you if they don't think their data is secure. And as we talked about earlier, if you're part of an organization's supply chain, then they may absolutely move away from you as well. And there'll be some risks around that. So that's one of the key things that we need to be thinking about, and why it is so important for organizations and boards in particular to understand their cyber risk.
Yeah, so from a G4S perspective, I think just touching on from what Nadia and James have said, it's definitely also a big topic for us. It's safe to say this is the next pandemic, if it's not already here. And we've moved to we work with a lot of information. We always make the joke internally in G4S that we're a big ship, so it doesn't turn easily. And that's because we work with a lot of information. It's a lot of people all at once working with the information. And in South Africa, we're still busy with it, but we're working towards getting ourselves accredited at an ISO 18788 level, which is the Security Operation Management System. And it's heavily focused on not only human rights, but also on the way that you deal with data. We've got, as a business, just from a good example would be, we do a lot of access control. A lot of people enter a building and we take basic information, whether they telling us that they're Harry Potter or not, You know, they would say name, surname, maybe ID number, which is quite a threat for them. Most people don't want to give that, and then a cell phone number. But because we deal with that information and we get a lot of it, it's now digital, it's not just paper-based. They need to know what happens with that. And like Nadia mentioned, Poppy, that's a big threat, not a big threat for us, it controls that information, but it's a threat for the business if we don't comply. So we need to make sure that we do comply. And then in terms of the fact that we work throughout Africa with most of what we do in South Africa, there's obviously GDPR compliance that's also required. And we then require that inherently from all our suppliers and the service offerings that they provide to us.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think as we're coming to the end, we'll just run a final poll, and then, because I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about. If we could fire that up, please, Emma. So how are your employees trained in cybersecurity? And then you can see IT staff only, IT and management only, all employees, no, please comment. The reason I read them out is so for the video recording. What's really interesting to hear and is encouraging to hear that cyber is second on board's agendas at the moment. So it is in the boardroom, it is part of their strategies beyond the pandemic. I think the challenge and the opportunity then is around training to cascade that across the organization, to embed it into your induction, your training, your policies, but importantly, your kind of working culture and linking that to performance and good business. As we're waiting for those results to come through, I'm going to introduce the final topic, which Nadia's kind of really introduced already and we started discussing, and really welcome your concluding comments as we go around the panelists and respond to this. But the digitization, digital agenda has been radically accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. It has meant that more people from ever are working from home. We learn of 30,000 staff at BT. There are 120,000 staff across Africa and G4S. I wonder how many can actually work from home. But how has this impacted on the digital world and cybersecurity from your perspective? And one of several of our clients that we work with, London Dynamics, Dragonfly, part of Capita Scaling Partners, we help them launch their businesses into the African continent, into the African markets. And they said the digitization economy, the digital economy has accelerated by as much as 10 years within 1 year. But it'd be great to go around the panel, get your thoughts on that. We'll start with you, Alice, and then perhaps hear some concluding comments from each of you as we're just nearing the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought I was on mute. Well, I like I mentioned earlier, I think for me, what I can say is that the increased security risks from remote working have been pretty much employees accessing virtual private networks outside offices, or which end up not being safe at all. Someone mentioned about using our personal devices to carry out our work and functions for office, sharing our emails with our family members, or even just our computers and gadgets. So you find that you go home and then every person can access your laptop or computer, which and everyone has your login accounts, which definitely has turned out to create a lot of vulnerabilities for so many businesses. But we usually advise different businesses, small or big, on several ways of actually being able to detect cybersecurity threats. And again, I mentioned earlier, could be you have to take the annual checks, or just to double check what kind of systems you have and what kind of breaches you have, because that definitely helps with your compliance. And then lastly, I would say your question was, what can governments do? What can companies do in terms of preventing cyber crime or cyber threats within, I guess, different organizations? One, I would say, when you have strict laws, you're definitely able to comply with them. Companies or organizations will be able to comply with them. And when you have a strong enforcement team, or rather systems, then whoever knows, like Nadia said, that the PR that comes with any breach or data breach definitely is a very ugly experience. So for me, I would think that definitely enforcement, strong enforcement of these our laws or regulations would definitely be able to get us a long way in terms of fighting cybercrime. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Thanks very much. Perhaps come to you, Nadia.
Oh, fantastic, thanks. And so I saw this fantastic graphic, and maybe it's not a fantastic graphic, but I mean, it's a scary graphic. It was the spread of the pandemic overlaid with the increase in cyber threats. And as the pandemic kind of spread across the world, you'd see, physically all these threats. And so, criminals have taken this as an opportunity in so many ways. It's galvanized them to just be bolder, to be more efficient, to actually have a wider reach, because we have leapfrogged our, our virtual lives in such a tremendous way. But two parting shots that I want us to leave with, and I think these are the things that keep me up at night. The one is that we really do need to be able to, even if it's at a basic level, create a lot more awareness around cybersecurity with SMMEs, right? Because they're the cold face of this battle. And, they are super vulnerable. We created a vulnerability index for SMMEs that go through our program, and to actually see how few of them are on the top end, so most of them are in this, very vulnerable space. So, we need to be able to kind of get everybody on board with the idea of even something basic can save a business, right? And so this is the whole idea. The other piece, and I will be remiss in talking about this because, I've been very passionate in a lot of my life. I've worked around diversity, equity, inclusion in the engineering and tech space. And we need not only more women in more cybersecurity professionals in general, but we need more women. I think it's something like 2% of all internet service providers have women at the helm. And so, we've got about 10% of women in cybersecurity. And what does this mean? So it's not just about numbers and equity, but it means that, you need diversity when you're thinking about how to actually prevent attacks, right? And how to actually design better policy systems and processes in companies to create, better and stronger support. And when you don't have, diverse people at that design table, you actually are going to make sure that you don't have the best solution. And so it's really about, thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion in cybersecurity. And then my last piece, and I promise I'll stop talking, is the vulnerability. So, that being said about how, because women have been excluded largely, we face the internet in very different ways. And so there is an increased attack and threat around women. And now because we've taken all our kids and we've put them online as well in a way that we may wanted to have protected them for a little bit longer from, the virtual worlds and the terrors of the virtual world, they're now all in Zoom classrooms. They're using all sorts of apps to be able to kind of educate themselves because of the pandemic. The vulnerability and children at this point is something that we really need to speak about, because not all these systems have the safety nets to be able to kind of protect our kids. So, that's the stuff that keeps me up at night. And hopefully we can, get us a little bit more safer online.
Now, thanks, Nadia. You raise a fascinating topic there around the diversity inclusion piece, which has been accelerated, and the risk that brings, but also the opportunities to upskill and really include more people in the economy. I think that's a topic we should re-explore as a chamber with you. Perhaps coming to you, James, and then to Sean, your kind of observation around the acceleration of the digital economy and your kind of key takeaways and concluding points.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, the rate of change and the pace of change has accelerated. I think you're absolutely right when you mentioned earlier, we've seen 10 years worth of change done in 12 months on the back of the pandemic. And we've seen that as customers are changing their digital infrastructure and their IT infrastructure. I think there's two bits to go with that. One is what we're seeing is as people are moving and changing, is they're embedding security by design. They're embedding security in at the forefront. It's top of mind now. And that's one of the things that we need to continue to do. And I would suggest that people do. I think I wouldn't mind just touching base on Nadia's point as well. Absolutely. Diversity and inclusion is so important. And in the cyber world, that does give us a unique edge as well. We talked about before, cybercriminals is a global organization. They share, they collaborate together. And you need different approaches, you need different understanding, you need different diversity within your organisation to understand that and to be able to respond on a like-for-like basis. So I think just sort of in my closing points, probably a couple of things to take away and to think about. One is when you're looking at your organisation, understand your business, understand what's valuable to a criminal. So what could cause you harm? Is it loss of customer data? Is it loss of intellectual property? Is it denial of service? Is it financial transaction intercept? So what are the main threats that your business will face? And then at least if you can understand them, you can start doing something about it. Get the basics right. Make sure you are accepting these updates. I know they're annoying, but when you see a latest version or an update and your machine tells you to do it, and similarly in your IT infrastructure, make sure you deploy those patches, because the majority of attacks come or occur when people haven't deployed known fixes to problems. Focus on your employees. Get them to become your first line of defense. Help them to look out for unusual or suspect activity. But more importantly, give them a clear way to report issues and in a safe environment so that you can become more aware of what's going on and you can react quickly. Because if you can react quickly, you can prevent a breach. But make security, as I was saying, frictionless as possible. Build it into everything you do from the start. Every application, every service, every process. Think about security and cybersecurity as you do it. It's much easier to deploy it while you're building than to come in and retrospectively try and fix it. And what you don't want is you don't want security to be the people who say, no, you can't transform. As security professionals, we need to be there to help a business to transform rather than prevent it from transforming. And I think my final one is always challenge yourself and continuously review your processes, because what's fit for purpose today won't be in 3, 6, 12 months' time. We know that this space is accelerating at a tremendous rate.
Thanks, James. I think I'll come back to that in my concluding points. Really appreciate you joining us from Singapore. Thank you. And Sean, your observations of the pace of change and indeed your closing comments.
Yeah, thank you, Leon. So, as I mentioned, we've been necessitated by customers to look after their security in a different way. We as a business have also been necessitated with the fact that we use a lot more technology. We need to be careful with the information that we get, how protected it is. And we're a big organization that makes sure that we protect information as much as possible. We've got a good global IT team that looks after it. But it's webinars like this and a panel discussion like this that puts different things into perspective. I think diversity just in general is something that needs to be brought in any business, not just cybersecurity, because it's different aspects that you learn and different viewpoints. And I just wanted to show the team on the call. There's this little flash drive that I've always kept with me, and this has been the cause for a 2-week shutdown of 3 of our servers, because there was we loaded the supplier software and they couldn't do it over the cloud, and they had to physically plug in a flash drive, and it was on a new machine. The machine was unprotected. We just got it the day before, and it put ransomware on our servers, and it nearly crippled us. Luckily, we have that tested everything that we had from a cybersecurity perspective, and it was contained and fixed, and we learned a lot from it. But I always keep that with me. I'm going to frame it one day, because that's just as a reminder of something that you need to keep in mind. Something as simple as a flash drive that we're all used to using could be your biggest threat.
No, thanks, Sean, and that's a great example. Cecilia, any final comments from you, observations, questions from the audience?
It's just really good to hear everyone's different perspectives, from entrepreneurs and small businesses to large corporations that are rolling out these things globally. I do think also the law aspect, it's quite scary to hear about the lack of law, but then also, of course, as you say, the lack of enforcement. And it actually, my concluding comment, it brought back a memory. It's happened a couple of years ago, but one Friday afternoon, I got a call here at the chamber from a person, didn't know this person at all, but said that they had paid for something they thought they'd bought online. The money had left their bank account and they traced it to a bank account in the UK. They want their money back and the police will not help them. The bank has said, can't do anything about it. And because it was a UK bank account, they thought the British Chamber is now the one to do this. So, and I think it just brought to mind again, people don't always know where to go. I think because there's a lack of knowing what are your digital rights, and if something does go wrong, where does the law stand? What is on your side? Where do you go to report it? Who's going to actually enforce anything? Who's going to do anything about it? And I think that all just feeds into a bigger system of also, until something goes wrong with you, you can just pretend it's all going to be fine. No one's going to steal your money or your emails. I think there is very much a little bit of that perception going on, as if it's a big threat out there. It's my company's problem. It's not really, or it's the IT department's problem. And I think that's the whole thing that also needs to change.
Thanks, Cecilia. I remember that when they called in to see what we could do. Do we have any final questions? Did Mary Lou want to say something that I remember?
Mary Lou had a great comment. Still online. Mary Lou from Living Facts, who's done quite a bit of research into IT on the continent. I think she's had to drop off already. We'll contact her afterwards.
Cool. No, thanks very much, Cecilia. And perhaps before I conclude and thank the panelists, and again, perhaps the results of our final poll that we could look at. So are your employees trained in cybersecurity? 90% yes, IT staff only. All employees, 63%. Okay, that's not too bad. No, 19%. So some real, even at 37% not being trained presents as a risk. I'd really like to thank this. I think we've scratched the surface of real critical topic here. And what's really standing out to me is all the other elements of business, good strategy, good training, good people policies that are linked to this. I'm really comforted to hear that this is number 2 in the boardroom as one of their priorities after the COVID, which is understandable. I think it's what we do with it from there. I think some of the key lessons I've taken away are the human firewall, to use your expression, James, kind of links to something that everybody said, Nadia, Sean, and yourself, Alice, in terms of raising awareness. If we raise awareness, can bring in training, we are going to improve that human firewall, which is our first and best line of defense. Diversity and inclusion, much maligned here in South Africa. There are 3 strands to diversity and inclusion: the legal, the moral, and the business case. The legal place, the much maligned BBBEE legislation addresses something. The moral case is one we all like to think of, but it's the business case that gets shareholders on board listening. If we are excluding a massive part of our market, a massive part of our potential workforce, we're going to lose money. And actually, it's the right thing to do, but it's the right thing to do from a business perspective as well. And that's something I think, Nadia, we should pick up and look at how we can use the chamber ecosystem to really celebrate what you're doing, but increase that inclusion piece through training and awareness. Training, it's the human firewall, it's diversity and inclusion. I've got it as a separate point. Training, you know, to constantly assume people know what's doing. We're in a constantly changing environment. The pace of change has never been such. We're living in these VUCA times, which I often refer to. What worked last year will not work this year. So we have to be dynamic, leading, training, empowering our employees. And from the legal perspective is linked to that. I'm talking about the awareness from the consumer, but having the legislative framework in place that's correctly ratified, but then upskilling the enforcement officers and the prosecutors and the judges to ensure that we can protect our consumers and customers. It's been a really interesting, riveting, diverse debate. I would really like to thank you all. So Nadia, Sean, Alice and James, Alice in Uganda, James in Singapore, Nadia in Cape Town, Sean up the road in Stanton. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise. If you want to contact them, please reach out to the chamber and we will put you in touch. To my colleague Cecilia for putting the agenda together and the speakers together and really feeding in the questions, really appreciate it. To EMA Mission Control, thank you for running the polls, and to Leslie and Venice for making sure we're all in the right place at the right time with the right link. And we are cyber secure, I hope. And finally, I'd really like to thank again Vicky White from the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. Thank you for sponsoring us, for enabling this panel, this platform, and for sharing what the British government is doing in those really important bilateral talks with the South African government and beyond. Again, if you'd like to get in touch with Vicky, please reach out to us. I'd like to remind everybody this has been recorded. We will share this through our digital platforms, and we'll also put a highlights reel together. And we will be doing some more anti-corruption roundtables and cyber stuff in the future. So please watch this space for our next events. We're looking forward now at level 1 to doing some in-person stuff, but we're going to keep our webinar series going. Thank you very much to the members for participating, and thanks again for a great panelist lineup. Have a great day, everybody. Stay cyber aware, cyber resilient. Thank you.